Hi. Hi, it's about 5 minutes and still the start of the live stream, but I wanted to take a minute and talk to you people who are watching this later, who are watching the recorded version instead of the live stream. I'm glad you're here. I'm really happy that you've stopped by, that you're curious about what's going on. I want to encourage you to come and join us on Tuesday evenings. If you're watching here on my J.S. Brooks channel here on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe. You see that the red rectangle over there on the side. Subscribe to us there. Or if you're watching this on the Lansdowne Baptist Church blog site, go on over to YouTube, find J.S. Brooks. There's a little cartoon picture of my face. You'll recognize it when you see it. Go there and subscribe. It'll tell you what to do when you get there. And become a regular member. Come and you'll get little warnings about when the next episode is coming up. Notifications, not warnings. Good grief. And hey, if you're in the area, come on Sunday morning and worship with us at Lansdowne Baptist Church in Lansdowne, Pennsylvania. You'll find us at 10 o'clock in the morning throughout the summer, and when we get back to fall, we'll be at 11 o'clock in the morning. So, a couple of things to know. This is an application, life application Bible study here. So we're going to be telling you how this applies to your everyday life. All the information that you receive. We're also using a biblical storyteller's approach. So when I read from Scripture, the reading may be a little more lively than you're used to. A little more interesting when it boils right down to it. For hundreds of years, people in the past, they were grim about their approach to the Bible. Well, that's no longer so. We go for an approach that's closer now to what the original hearers would have experienced, because you wanted people to be able to remember what they heard. Most people couldn't read. So they listened to the Bible stories and they engaged with it that way. And we're going to try to give you some of that in the readings of Scripture that'll happen throughout the live stream. Tonight we're finishing the book of Esther. And this has been a really interesting study because the book of Esther was written for a time of festival, Purim, a time of celebration. And so this is a liberation story that uses a lot of rabbinical exaggeration to make its points and to make things entertaining for the listener, and by extension, very, very memorable. But in the book of Esther, there's an awful lot of very important material there on how to live our lives, how to be brave in the face of danger, how to speak truth to power when absolutely necessary, and how to save others who are in danger. That's what we're dealing with in the book of Esther. When we get into Matthew, which we will probably do tonight, then it's much more is the life story of Jesus. And the author is writing to a Jewish readership, and he's proving to a Jewish readership that Jesus was really the Messiah. He's a very different Messiah from the one they had been hoping for, which was a conquering king. And that's not what Jesus was all about. But he's proving to his readership and his listenership that this really was and is the Messiah. So that's what we're doing here. I hope you'll join us on a regular basis. And if you like what you see, let your friends know as well. We're not trying to keep this a secret. We're trying to make a lively, growing community. So I look forward to seeing you here. And the clock on the wall tells me it's just about time to start the live stream. I see we have 2 people watching at the moment. That's encouraging. So we're going to get it started now in just a minute. And glad you're here. Please subscribe, tell other people about it, and join this little community. We're going to be growing over time, and we'd love to have you as a part of it, where we can all study the Bible together, learn a lot, have our lives enriched, and become better followers of Jesus Christ in the process. God bless you, And now it's time to begin. Good evening. Welcome. I'm Reverend Jeff Snyder, and this is Beyond Loaves and Fishes, the live stream Bible study. Tonight we're going to finish up the book of Esther, and we'll begin our study of the book of Matthew. So after that, I'll be taking suggestions. So if you start thinking about what book you'd like to pursue after Matthew, Matthew's going to take us a little while longer than Esther did, because it's a much bigger book. But that's where we're going to go, and I'll be very happy to hear where you all would like to go next. As you start coming on, say hello on the chat. Let me know who's with us tonight, and we'll get rolling. I see, according to this, we now have 3. Hello, I'm glad to see you. I'm glad you're here. Well, I'm glad to see that you're here. I can't actually see you. It doesn't work that way. That would be interesting, but no, that's not the way the things go. So now we're going to begin with Esther again. Like I said, say hello. Hey, Julius. Hello, Sherry. I'm glad you're both here. And as other people come rolling in, I'll say hi to them as well. Now, last week when we left off, King Ahasuerus, he had an unusual way of managing things. He tended to turn them over entirely to other people. And he's done that once again, this time to his wife, Queen Esther, and to her uncle, Mordecai. And they have decided that the Jews should not be wiped out from the people. They should not be expunged from the Persian Empire. But instead, they were going to be saved. And not only saved, but they would be allowed to decide the fate of themselves and fate of other people. So let's go ahead and read what's going on here. But I want you to remember, when this gets intense, that there's a lot of rabbinical exaggeration going on here. I'm going to go ahead and read, starting in chapter 9, verses 1 through 10, if you want to follow along. Now, in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edicts were about to be executed, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain power over them, but which had been changed to a day when the Jews would gain power over their foes, the Jews gathered in their cities throughout all of the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who had sought their ruin. This is getting exciting. Hey, Cheney, I'm glad you're here. Hi to you and your whole family. So, the suspense builds now. People are leaning forward, listening to what's going to happen next, and no one could understand them, could withstand them, sorry about that, because the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All the officials of the provinces, the satraps and the governors and the royal officials were supporting the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was powerful in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. As the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful, so the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, slaughtering and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 people. They killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmastha, Arisa, Arida, Viazatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not touch the plunder. We go on. Hey, Will, glad to see you're with us as well. We go on. There's more. Chapter 9, verses 11 through 15. That very day the number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther in the citadel of Susa, "The Jews have killed 500 people, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done to the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled." So this wasn't enough, huh? Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edicts, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 persons in Susa, but they did not touch the plunder. This is a very Game of Thrones sort of ending. A don't mess with Queen Esther kind of warning going on here. Over 2 days of Jewish defense of themselves, 75,000 non-Jewish Persians perished. Now again, this is storytelling exaggeration designed to add excitement to the story. Also, this is like ancient war reporting. In ancient war reporting, no matter what happened on the field, you said everybody got wiped out on the enemy side. Boy, they'll never mess with us again. That's how things work. This is what happens when God inspires the writers but allows the writers free rein in how they express their message so the people understand it. So you've got to expect some of this exaggeration. Now, in case, just to put this in some sort of perspective, imagine it's 2,000 years from now, or more. There's a spacefaring civilization, and they look back and they see our Star Wars movies. There's the Death Star, and at the end it gets blown up, and now we all cheer because the bad guys got their comeuppance. But then in the future they're going to say, "Oh my goodness, how horrible, thousands and thousands of spacefaring people have been destroyed." Or in the most recent movie, you have a death planet, and the whole planet's wiped out. Well, this is that kind of entertainment. This is that kind of thing where you're basically saying, hooray, the bad guys have been done in. So, but there's a question that comes to mind here. How do we make a responsible use of power? That's a watchword for our lives today. How do we do that in a way that honors God and keeps things within a reasonable limit? And I'm going to ask these questions. You all can respond as you see fit. And you can respond amongst each other, because if I waited for you, there's a 10-second delay on me, my speaking to you and you hearing it. And then I'd have to wait for you to type in an answer, and I could be sitting here for 30 or 40 seconds saying nothing, and I just can't do that. I'm not wired for it. So I'll move on. Now, feel free to answer the questions as you see fit. Now, if the victors had seized the property, many families of those who had fallen would have been homeless and impoverished, and that was going beyond the pale. That was not considered moral back in the day. After 2 days of fighting, the Jews throughout the empire held a day of feasting and rejoicing, and that's the origin of Purim, the festival that this story would be read at each and every year. So that's why we've got Purim. Most of chapter 9 explains Mordecai's direction, who was now not only the high official of Persia, taking over from Haman. He's the high official of the court, but he's also a leader amongst the Jewish people. And the Feast of Purim is now established, and it'll be held annually on the 14th and 15th days of Adar, which are in February and March, somewhere in there. Once Haman had decided to have the Jews killed, he'd picked the execution by a casting of the dice called Pur, and the day selected was the 13th of Adar, which, as we now know, was the day of deliverance for the Jews. The annual celebration of the deliverance The storyteller says, receive the name Purim because it used the ancient word pur. You find that in chapter 9, verse 26. Purim was also a children's night in the synagogue, when the reading of Esther would take place, and children would come carrying flags and noisemakers and traditional whirling rattlers called groggers. Now, can you imagine having a church service where the reading of the text occurred, and while the text was being read, you would have flags and noisemakers and whirling rattlers all being used to emphasize different parts of the reading? Now, that would be a wildly different approach to scriptural text reading today, don't you think? Isn't it interesting? You talk about getting back to the way church used to be. Well, now, if we got back to this, that would be quite the wild experience. So, this is a different picture of ancient life than we usually imagine as well. You don't see too many pictures of people with flags and noisemakers sitting around listening to Scripture being read. It's just not the way we usually look at these things. Now, the reader of the scroll of Esther proceeds, and each time the name Haman is read, the children would respond loudly, stamping their feet, pounding on things, and whirling their groggers. Again, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing in the Sunday morning scripture reading, if you've got cheering and booing at different times for different parts of the Bible reading? It could give a whole new meaning to our worship on Sunday morning. Purim included 4 religious obligations. You heard the scroll of Esther read, you distributed charity to the poor, you made a feast, and you exchanged gifts with your neighbors and friends. Not a bad way to read the Bible, actually. Not a bad way to do it at all. Now, the last 3 were mandated in the book of Esther itself, along with the reasons for the holiday. So the business of distributing charity, making a feast, and offering up gifts is actually dictated in the manuscript itself. Again, it's a nice approach. Chapter 9, verse 22 reads, as the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days of sending gifts of food to one another, and presents to the poor. You're right, Cheney, that would be funny. Yeah, only the people here would know what was going on. We should try it sometime just to see and tell people if you actually watched this, you'd know what was going on. Finally, we have the epilogue. We get to chapter 10, and it's only 3 verses long. It tells us that within the Persian Empire, Mordecai was now second only to King Ahasuerus himself in importance, and he always wanted to do good things for the Jewish people. Well, that's a fairly good ending. Well, we see responsible use of power here, employed for the profit of others rather than for self-aggrandizement. Here's a big difference between Mordecai and Haman. Haman was all about himself, and that's what got him into trouble. His ego got overly large. He got really angry over the slightest scent or whiff of an insult to him, and then set up a whole bunch of terrible schemes to try to get even with one man, but not only with one man, but all of that man's people. And Mordecai, on the other hand, is looking out for his people. He gets Esther to help with that, or she takes a lead role in all of this, as a matter of fact, at his urging. And that is a radically different use of power, one that should be encouraged in leaders today, rather than a self-aggrandizement or a lining of their own pockets, or somebody who's becoming very incensed by small slights. I don't know if we can think of anyone like that today, but You know, if anything sounds familiar to you, go ahead and pipe up. How different would our world be if everyone took this lesson to heart and spent a whole lot more time working for the benefit of others, which is something that God calls us to do. Those who study power dynamics for a living say that there are 6 bases from which power rises. We can have power over someone when, 1, we have information needed by another person. That's informational power. 2, when we can punish other people if they don't do what we want, if they don't respond positively to us. That's known as coercion. 3, we can provide rewards when a person responds as we want them to respond. And that, of course, is known as reward. 4, we have the right to demand a response, and that is considered to be authority. 5, we are able to move others to our force by our force of personality or by our psychological manipulation, and that's what we know as charisma. And 6, we can expose the other person to embarrassment or other social costs, and that's known as blackmail or Twitter. So, many of the temptations we face today are ultimately about the misuse of power. Can you think of any examples today of misuse of power based on those 6 categories? The things that Mordecai and Queen Esther did not do, but which Haman is the prime example of, this misuse of power. I'm sure we could come up with a whole lot of examples of that in the modern world, but it's something to think about. It's something we don't want to do. The misapplication of power creates harm for others, and that's not what we're trying to do. Much of the harm we do to other people, we do when we misuse our power. And all of us have some degree of power. Maybe not a lot, but some. Much of the good that we do in life is because we use our power responsibly. As Stanley said, those who are given great power have great responsibility. And that's a very good line. Now, what can we do to make positive use of power? That's something I want you to consider. And maybe have a list for next week that we can go over, ways in which power can be used positively. We are usually fooling ourselves when we say that we're powerless. Actually, we're letting ourselves off easy. It's worse than that. It's really just punting, when actually we all have a certain level of power, and it is our responsibility to use it wisely. In fact, it's a mandate from God that we use our power to the best of our ability. It's better to recognize what power we have and to consider carefully and prayerfully how we should use it, so that when we do, we end up glorifying God and benefiting someone else, which is exactly what Esther did. Esther is the prime example of this very thing. So, even when personal risk is involved, or perhaps especially when personal risk is involved. So, how will you go forth with the courage and forethought of Queen Esther to use your power wisely, and who will you help? Who could be helped now by the proper application of power, by speaking up on their behalf right now in this moment, by taking to task leaders who have gone astray like a King Ahasuerus did, who maybe are listening to loud voices, influential voices. In Ahasuerus' case, it was whoever he spoke to most recently had a great influence on him. So how could we influence those people to do better in the world? We would like them to be successful, but it's something to consider, because it's a serious problem today, and some of the most recent news has made it very serious indeed. We have people who are being called animals now. They're being dehumanized. And once you dehumanize somebody, they're at grave risk. So, yes, well, there are many scary parallels with today's events. And that's something where we really need to speak out. There's been misapplication of Bible verses, as a matter of fact, and the Methodists have taken it upon themselves. Over 600 clergy and Methodist members have sent a letter to Jeff Sessions saying, you have misused Romans 13, and we need you to rein that in. We need you to stop that, because the misuse that you've used is the kind of excuse that people use to do terrible things, like to excuse slavery, for instance. That you listen to what we say, and you don't question us, and that led to an extension of slavery for a long period of time. All right, well, that's the book of Esther. We have finished it up, and we are now going to head into the book of Matthew. And after we do Matthew, it'll be open to you all where you want to go next. I will be interested in here, and please let's get some ideas early in the process, because I'll have to get the book and get some books and do some research before we can begin it. So I highly encourage you to start early. So moving on into the book of Matthew, let's a couple little things to discuss. There will be times. Thank you, Cheney. I'm glad you enjoyed Esther. I did too. It's one of my favorites because it is such an interesting difference from the way the Bible is treated so often. It really makes things livelier and more interesting. I think it's a great place to start. Now, in Matthew, we're going to be getting, of course, into one of the Gospels. We're going to really be proving who Jesus was and who Jesus is and how Jesus wants us all to live our lives. And there's several things I wanted to go over. There's some quotes I thought I'd use. We're living in a really contentious age. And I want to talk about dialoguing rather than debating. Not that I think we're going to have much debate here, but I like to get this out into the public when we begin a book. Jim Henderson wrote, Debate is about humiliating your opponent. Dialogue is about inviting your friend into conversation. Jesus was a master dialogist. He didn't use power to overcome. He used kindness to overwhelm. To dialogue successfully, listening trumps talk, and reflection trumps reactivity. I like that. John 14:12 reads, Jesus, the master dialogist, said, Very truly I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and in fact will do greater works than these, because I am going to the Father. And finally, the author Joshua Dubois' grandmother opined, Never spend time arguing with a fool, because from a distance people can't tell who's who. I love that. That's really the whole reason I went through that, was to get to that. All right, now, before we're going to give you some background this week, and then we'll begin seriously to study the book next week. So, someone had previously asked a question about the naming of the book of Matthew. Well, the naming of the 4 gospel books largely goes from church tradition. And we honor that church tradition because naming was a rather fluid subject back in the day. Different traditions for a different period of time. So, another title for the book of Matthew would be An Account of the Genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. I prefer the title Matthew. It's succinct, it's easy to say, and it beats chapter 1, verse 1 of Matthew. So, we're going to stick with church tradition. And if you want to get into it further, take a look at Popius, the church elder from about 130 AD. There's a whole argument about that, but it gets deeply into the weeds, and we really don't have the time to do that today. Nor do I want to. All right. Matthew is considered to be the gospel that is the most beneficial for life application studies. It's the purpose of our group here to explore biblical application to everyday life, so Matthew is a natural for us. This is considered to be the most Jewish of all the Gospels, and it details Jesus' Jewish origins and identity. The book clearly ties the Hebrew Scriptures to the Gospels, which is interesting. Yeah, am I going to read all those names? No. I'm not going to read the entire genealogy for you. I'm going to skip right on past that. Yeah, you couldn't pronounce most of them. I'd have to fake quite a few of them. So we're just going to save ourselves that pain today. The book clearly ties the Hebrew Scriptures to the Gospel, which is interesting in my upbringing because I was raised in a Southern Baptist church. And the Southern Baptists, well, some of the stricter Southern Baptists would kind of like to have avoided the whole Old Testament, saying that that's really not what we need to look at. We need to look at Jesus. But Jesus used the original Testaments on a regular basis, as the book of Matthew makes clear, which was never emphasized in my upbringing, which is kind of interesting. So, but Matthew indicates quite clearly that both of those testaments belong together. They are one. It shows that the best basis for understanding the New Testament can be found in the Hebrew Scriptures. The Old Testament prepares the way for our understanding of the New Testament. It is making that road straight for Jesus when he comes. For Matthew, Jesus is God's anointed. Jesus is the Messiah, the one who is best envisioned and best interprets God's plan for God's people. He really is the Messiah, even though you wanted a conquering king mounted on a white horse, full of armor, the big sword, and you didn't get it. Still, this is the guy. And that's what Matthew will insist all the way through. Jesus is presented as the great teacher of the people of Israel, which resonates with the Jewish people because this tells them that Jesus is the Moses of the current age. So that's a very important designation. Moses was held in extremely high regard. So Jesus speaks with a wisdom and authority no one in the world could match. And his lineage, the importance of his lineage is that it traces him back to Abraham and to David. This is really important because all true rulers were traced themselves back to the line of David. In fact, you could not be a king if you were not of David's line. In fact, that will create a lot of problems in the late period before the New Testament when some leaders came up from a different lineage, and that caused a huge problem for the people of Israel because that's not the way it was supposed to work. Now, if you think this whole idea of lineage and all of these names coming down through the ages is a thing of the past and gone, you haven't visited Indiana. You haven't been amongst people that I know out there, because my mother-in-law, God rest her soul, would give you the lineage of everyone that she wanted to talk about. You'd find out who their parents and their grandparents were. So this has not ended today. There are still people who will trace lineages back to ground a person in their family and in history, and that's what they've done here. And they're making the very important statement that that Jesus comes from the line of kings, and he can be traced all the way back to Abraham. And Matthew will return frequently to Old Testament texts to explain the actions that Jesus undertook, to show that this was fulfillment of prophecy that the true Messiah would make. Matthew is contentious at times, though, and this has been misused a lot in history. He was writing after 70 AD in the fall of the temple in Jerusalem, And there was a lot of struggle amongst the leadership of Joe's grandmother does that too. All right, good. I'm glad to know that it's this naming tradition and lineages goes around a long way. So there were struggles in leadership, and there was a lot of anger going on between the early Christian community and the Jewish community. They were starting to pull apart. And so with this tension, the Pharisees weren't treating Matthew and his people very well, and Matthew casts them very much as the bad guys. He describes the Pharisees as hypocrites and teachers who lock people out of the kingdom of heaven. There were a huge amount of tension between different Jewish groups over which laws and traditions ought to govern Israel. So there's a big struggle going on at this time. So it's no surprise that in the book of Matthew we see Jesus arguing about the law and the traditions that would govern Israel. And Jesus and the Pharisees would be in dispute over a great many things. Over the traditions of the elders, Sabbath observances, divorces, taxes, and what is the greatest commandment. And at this point, I see... Oh, but there's one more point that I really need to make. And this angry language was a squabble amongst various Jewish groups. And when they say the Jews, they're having an argument with them, they're talking about the Jewish leadership, not the Jewish people, not the Jewish nation. And here's a danger, because this has been misinterpreted many times, to blame the entire Jewish people for things that were not their responsibility, things they should never have been blamed for, and has led to a great deal of persecution over the generations, something we must break as responsible Christians today. We cannot allow that to continue. Now, finally, one last thing to know about the book of Matthew is that the author of Matthew knows us and challenges us to a new and more wonderful and more demanding life. And we'll see exactly how the author does that when we begin next week to study the book of Matthew in earnest. We'll talk about the lineage, but I will not be reading it to you. So please do show up next week, and we'll begin. I look forward to seeing you then. And if you have a chance, tell other people about this, get them to join. And if you're stumbling across this later, if you're watching the recording, hit subscribe and join us. And as I said before, if you're in the neighborhood, stop by Lansdowne Baptist Church in Lansdowne, Pennsylvania, and worship with us on Sunday morning. We'll be delighted to have you there. But for now, I wish you all a good night and God's blessing. I hope God goes with you until we meet again. Good night. Goodbye.